Section 18 of the Satyricon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. The Satyricon by Gaius Petronius ARBITER. Translated by W.C. FIREBAUGH. Section 18. Volume 5. Affairs at Crotona. Chapters 132 to 137. Chapter the 132nd. The loveliness of her form drew me to her and summoned me to love. Our lips were pressed together in a torrent of smacking kisses, our groping hands had discovered every trick of excitation, and our bodies, clasped in a mutual embrace, had fused our souls into one. And then, in the very midst of these ravishing preliminaries, my nerves again played me false, and I was unable to last until the instant of supreme bliss. Lashed to fury by these inexcusable affronts, the lady at last ran to avenge herself, and, calling her house servants, she gave orders for me to be hoisted upon their shoulders and flogged. Then, still unsatisfied with the drastic punishment she had inflicted upon me, she called all the spinning women and scrubbing wenches in the house, and ordered them to spit upon me. I covered my face with my hands, but I uttered no complaint, as I well knew what I deserved, and, overwhelmed with blows and spittle, I was driven from the house. Proselinus was kicked out too, Chrysis was beaten, and all the slaves grumbled among themselves and wondered what had upset their mistress's good humour. I took heart after having given some thought to my misfortunes, and, artfully concealing the marks of the blows, for fear that Eumolpus would make merry over my mishaps, or, worse yet, that Giton might be saddened by my disgrace, I did the only thing I could do to save my self-respect. I pretended that I was sick, and went to bed. There I turned the full fury of my resentment against that recreant which had been the sole cause of all the evil accidents which had befallen me. 3 times I grasped the two-edged blade, the recreant to cut away. 3 times by fear my hand was stayed, and palsied terror said me nay. That which I might have done before 'twas now impossible to do. For cold with fear, the wretch withdrew into 1,000 wrinkled mare, and shrank in shame before my gaze, nor would his head uncover more. But though the scamp in terror skulked, with words I flayed him as he sulked. Raising myself upon my elbow, I rebuked the shirker in some such terms as these. "What have you to say for yourself, you disgrace to gods and men?" I demanded. "For your name must never be mentioned among refined people. Did I deserve to be lifted up to heaven and then dragged down to hell by you? Was it right for you to slander my flourishing and vigorous years, and land me in the shadows and lassitude of decrepit old age? Give me some sign, however faint, I beg of you, that you have returned to life." I vented my anger in words such as these. His eyes were fixed, and with averted look he stood, less moved by any word of mine than weeping willows bending o'er a brook, or drooping poppies as at noon they pine. When I had made an end of this invective, so out of keeping with good taste, I began to do penance for my soliloquy, and blushed furtively because I had so far forgotten my modesty as to invoke in words that part of my body which men of dignity do not even recognize. Then, rubbing my forehead for a long time, "Why have I committed an indiscretion in relieving my resentment by natural abuse?" I mused. "What does it amount to? Are we not accustomed to swear at every member of the human body? The belly, throat, or even the head when it aches, as it often does? Did not Ulysses wrangle with his own heart? Do not the tragedians damn their eyes, just as if they could hear? Gouty patients swear at their feet, rheumatics at their hands, blear-eyed people at their eyes. And do not those who often stub their toes blame their feet for all their pain? Why will our Catos with their frowning brows condemn a work of fresh simplicity. A cheerful kindness my pure speech endows, what people do, I write, to my capacity. For who knows not the pleasures Venus gives? Who will not in a warm bed tease his members? Great Epicurus taught a truth that lives, love and enjoy life. All the rest is embers. Nothing can be more insincere than the silly prejudices of mankind, and nothing sillier than the morality of bigotry. Chapter the 133rd. I called Giton when I had finished my meditation. "Tell me, little brother," I demanded, "tell me, on your honour, did Ascyltus stay awake until he had exacted his will of you, the night he stole you away from me, or was he content to spend the night like a chaste widow?" Wiping his eyes, the lad, in carefully chosen words, took oath that Ascyltus had used no force against him. The truth of the matter is that I was so distraught with my own misfortunes that I knew not what I was saying. "Why recall past memories which can only cause pain?" said I to myself. I then directed all my energies towards the recovery of my lost manhood. To achieve this I was ready even to devote myself to the gods. Accordingly I went out to invoke the aid of Priapus. Putting as good a face upon the matter as I could, I knelt upon the threshold of his shrine and invoked the god in the following verses: "Of Bacchus and the nymphs companion boon, whom fair Dione set o'er forests wide as god, whom Lesbos and green Thasos own for deity, whom Lydians far and wide adore through all the seasons of the year, whose temple in his own high Piper placed, thou Dryad's joy, and Bacchus's hear my prayer. To thee I come, by no dark blood disgraced, no shrine in wicked lust have I profaned. When I was poor and worn with want, I sinned not by intent, a pauper's sins not banned as of another. Unto thee I pray, lift thou the load from off my tortured mind, forgive a light offence. When fortune smiles, I'll not thy glory shun and leave behind thy worship. Unto thee, a goat that feels his primest vigour, father of the flocks shall come, and suckling pigs, the tender young of some fine grunting sow. New wine in crocks shall foam, thy grateful praises shall be sung by youths who thrice shall dance around thy shrine, happy in youth and full of this year's wine." While I was engaged in this diplomatic effort in behalf of the affected member, a hideous crone with dishevelled hair, and clad in black garments which were in great disorder, entered the shrine, and laying hands upon me, led me, thoroughly frightened, out into the portico. Chapter the 134th. "What witches," she cried, "have devoured your manhood? What filth did you tread upon at some cross-roads in the dark? Not even by the boy could you do your duty, but, weak and effeminate, you are worn out like a cart-horse at a hill. You have lost both labour and sweat. Not content with getting yourself into trouble, you have stirred up the wrath of the gods against me, and I will make you smart for it." She then led me, unresisting, back into the priestess's room, pushed me down upon the bed, snatched a cane that hung upon the door, and gave me another thrashing. I remained silent, and, had the cane not splintered at the first stroke, thereby diminishing the force of the blow, she might easily have broken my arms or my head. I groaned dismally, and especially when she manipulated my member, and, shedding a flood of tears, I covered my head with my right arm, and huddled down upon the pillow, nor did she weep less bitterly. The sailor naked from his foundered bark, some shipwrecked mariner seeks out to hear his woe. When hail beats down a farmer's crop, his cark seeks consolation from another too. Death levels caste and sufferers unites, and weeping parents are as one in grief. We also will beseech the starry heights. United prayers climb best, is the belief. She seated herself upon the other side of the bed, and, in quavering tones, commenced to accuse the delays of old age. At last the priestess came in. "Why," she cried, "what has brought you into my cell as if you were visiting a newly made grave? And on a feast day, too, when even mourners ought to smile." "Enothea," the old hag replied, "this young man here was born under an unlucky star. He can't dispose of his goods to either boy or girl. Such an unfortunate fellow you never saw. He has no tool at all, only a piece of leather soaked in water. I wish you'd tell me what you think of a man who could get up from Circe's bed without having tasted pleasure." On hearing these words, Enothea sat down between us, and, after shaking her head for a while, "I'm the only one that knows how to cure that disease," said she, "and for fear you think I'm talking to hear myself talk, I'll just have the young fellow sleep with me for a night, and if I don't make it as hard as horn. All that you see in the world must give heed to my mandates. Blossoming earth, when I will it, must languish, a desert. Riches pour forth, when I will it, from crags and grim boulders. Waters will spurt that will rival the Nile at its flooding, seas calm their billows before me, gales silence their howlings, hearing my step, and the rivers sink into their channels. Dragons, Hyrcanian tigers stand fast at my bidding. Why should I tell you of small things? The image of Luna drawn by my spells must descend, and Apollo, a tremble, backs up his horses and turns from his course at my order. Such is the power of my word. By the rites of a virgin, quenched is the raging of bulls, and the sun's daughter Circe changed and transfigured the crew of the wily Ulysses. Proteus changes his form when his good pleasure dictates. I, who am skilled in these arts, can the shrubs of Mount Ida plant in the ocean, turn rivers to flow up the mountains. Chapter the 135th. At this declaration, which was so awe-inspiring, I shuddered in terror, and commenced to scrutinize the crone more narrowly. "Come now," said Enothea, "obey my orders," and, carefully wiping her hands, she bent over the cot and kissed me, once, twice. On the middle of the altar Enothea placed an old table, upon which she heaped live coals. Then with melted pitch she repaired a goblet which had become cracked through age. Next she replaced, in the smoke-stained wall, a peg which had come out when she took down the wooden goblet. Then, having donned a mantle, in the shape of a piece of square-cut cloth, she set a huge kettle upon the hearth, and at the same time speared with a fork a cloth hanging upon the meat-hooks, and lifted it down. It contained some beans, which had been laid away for future use, and a very small and stale piece of pig's cheek, scored with 1,000 slashes. When she had untied the string which fastened the cloth, she poured some of the beans upon the table, and ordered me to shell them quickly and carefully. I obey her mandate, and with careful fingers separate the beans from the filthy pods which contain them. But she, accusing my clumsiness, hastily snatched them, and, skilfully tearing off the pods with her teeth, spat them upon the ground, where they looked like dead flies. I wondered then at the ingenuity of poverty, and its expedients for emergency. So ardent a follower of this virtue did the priestess seem that it was reflected in everything around her. Her dwelling, in particular, was a very shrine of poverty. No Indian ivory set in gold gleamed here, no trodden marble glistened here, no earth mocked for its gifts, but Ceres' festive grove, with willow wicker work 'twas set around, new cups of clay by revolutions shaped of lowly wheel, for honey soft a bowl, platters of green bark wickerwork, a jar stained by the life-blood of the god of wine. The walls around with chaff and spattered clay were covered. Flanging from protruding nails were slender stalks of the green rush, and then suspended from the smoky beam the stores of this poor cottage. Service berries soft, entwined in fragrant wreaths hung down, dried savoury and raisins by the bunch, an hostess here, like she on Attic soil, of Hecate's pure worship worthy she, whose fame Callimachus so grandly sang, 'twill live for ever through the speaking years. Chapter the 136th. In the meantime, having shelled the beans, she took a mouthful of the meat, and with the fork was replacing the pig's cheek, which was coeval with herself, upon the meat-hook, when the rotten stool, which she was using to augment her height, broke down under the old lady's weight, and let her fall upon the hearth. The neck of the pot was broken, putting out the fire, which was just getting a good start. Her elbow was burned by a flaming brand, and her whole face was covered by the ashes raised by her fall. I jumped up in dismay, and, not without laughing, helped the old lady to her feet. She hastily scurried out into the neighbourhood to replenish the fire, for fear anything should delay the sacrifice. I was on my way to the door of the cell, when lo and behold, 3 sacred geese, which were accustomed, I suppose, to demand their feed from the old woman at midday, made a rush at me, and, surrounding me, made me nervous with their abominable rabid cackling. One tore at my tunic, another undid the lacings of my sandals and tugged at them, but one in particular, the ringleader and moving spirit of this savage attack, did not hesitate to worry at my leg with his serrated bill. Unable to see the joke, I twisted off one of the legs of the little table, and, thus armed, began to belabour the pugnacious brute. Nor did I rest content with a light blow, I avenged myself by the death of the goose. 'Twas thus, I ween, the birds of Stymphalus to heaven fled, by Heracles impelled. The harpies too, whose reeking pinions held that poison which the feast of Phineus contaminated, all the air above with their unwonted lamentations shook, the heavens in uproar and confusion move, the stars in dread their orbits then forsook. By this time the 2 remaining geese had picked up the beans which had been scattered all over the floor, and bereft, I suppose, of their leader, had gone back into the temple, and I, well content with my revenge and my booty, threw the dead goose behind the cot, and bathed the trifling wound in my leg with vinegar. Then, fearing a scolding, I made up my mind to run away, and, collecting together all my belongings, started to leave the house. I had not yet stepped over the threshold of the cell, however, when I caught sight of Oenothea returning with an earthen vessel full of live coals. Thereupon I retraced my steps, and, throwing off my garments, I took my stand just inside the door, as if I were awaiting her return. She banked her fire with broken reeds, piled some pieces of wood on top, and began to excuse her delay, on the ground that her friend would not permit her to leave until after the customary 3 drinks had been taken. "But what were you up to in my absence?" she demanded. "Where are the beans?" Thinking that I had done a thing worthy of all praise, I informed her of the battle in all its details, and, that she might not be downcast any longer, I produced the dead goose in payment for her loss. When the old lady laid eyes upon that, she raised such a clamour that you would have thought that the geese had invaded the room again. Confounded and thunderstruck at the novelty of my crime, I asked her why she was so angry, and why she pitied the goose rather than myself. Chapter the 137th. But, beating her palms together, "You villain! Are you so brazen that you can speak?" she shrieked. "Don't you know what a serious crime you've committed? You have slaughtered the delight of Priapus, a goose, the very darling of married women. And for fear you think that nothing serious has happened, if the magistrates find this out, you'll go to the cross. Until this day my dwelling has been inviolate, and you have polluted it with blood. You have conducted yourself in such a manner that any enemy I have can turn me out of the priesthood." She spoke, and from her trembling head she tore the snow-white hair, and scratched her cheeks. Her eyes shed floods of tears, as when a torrent headlong rushes down the valleys drear, its icy fetters gone when spring appears, and strikes the frozen shackles from rejuvenated earth, so down her face the tears in torrents swept, and racking sobs convulsed her as she wept. "Please don't make such a fuss," I said. "I'll give you an ostrich in place of your goose," while she sat upon the cot and, to my stupefaction, bewailed the death of the goose. Proserlenus came in with the materials for the sacrifice. Seeing the dead goose, and inquiring the cause of her grief, she herself commenced to weep more violently still, and to commiserate me, as if I had slain my own father, instead of a public goose. Growing tired of this nonsense at last, "See here," said I, "could I not purchase immunity for a price, even though I had assaulted you? Even though I had murdered a man? Look here, I'm laying down 2 gold pieces. You can buy both gods and geese with them." "Forgive me, young man," said Enothea, when she caught sight of the gold. "I am anxious upon your account. That is a proof of love, not of malignity. Let us take such precautions that not a soul will find this out. As for you, pray to the gods to forgive your sacrilege. The rich man can sail in a favouring gale, and snap out his course at his pleasure. A dance espouse, no Acrisius will rail, his credence by hers he will measure. Write verse or declaim, snap the finger of scorn at the world, yet still win all his cases. The rabble will drink in his words with concern, when a Cato austere it displaces. At law his not proven or proved he can have, with Servius or Labeo vying. With gold at command, anything he may crave is his without asking or sighing. The universe bows at his slightest behest, for Jove is a prisoner in his treasure chest. In the meantime, she scurried around and put a jar of wine under my hands, and, when my fingers had all been spread out evenly, she purified them with leeks and parsley. Then, muttering incantations, she threw hazelnuts into the wine, and drew her conclusions as they sank or floated. But she did not hoodwink me, for those with empty shells, no kernel and full of air, would of course float, while those that were heavy and full of sound kernel would sink to the bottom. She then turned her attention to the goose, and, cutting open the breast, she drew out a very fat liver, from which she foretold my future. Then, for fear any trace of the crime should remain, she cut the whole goose up, stuck the pieces upon spits, and served up a very delectable dinner for me, whom, but a moment before, she had herself condemned to death, in her own words. Meanwhile, cups of unmixed wine went merrily around, and the crones greedily devoured the goose which they had but so lately lamented. When the last morsel had disappeared, Enothea, half drunk by this time, looked at me and said, "We must now go through with the mysteries, so that you may get back your virility." End of section 18. Section 19 of the Satyricon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. The Satyricon, by Gaius Petronius ARBITER. Translated by W.C. FIREBAUGH. Section 19. Volume 5. Affairs at Crotona. Chapters 138 to 141. Chapter the 138th. As she said this, Enothea brought out a leathern dildo, which, when she had smeared it with oil, ground pepper, and pounded nettle seed, she commenced to force, little by little, up my anus. The merciless old virago then anointed the insides of my thighs with the same decoction. Finally, mixing nasturtium juice with elixir of southern wood, she gave my genitals a bath, and, picking up a bunch of green nettles, she commenced to strike me gently all over my belly below the navel. The nettles stung me horribly, and I suddenly took to my heels, with the old hags in full pursuit. Although they were befuddled with wine and lust, they followed the right road and chased me through several wards, screaming, "Stop, thief!" I made good my escape, however, although every toe was bleeding as the result of my headlong flight. I got home as quickly as I could, and, worn out with fatigue, I sought my couch, but I could not snatch a wink of sleep, for the evil adventures which had befallen me kept running through my brain, and, brooding upon them, I came to the conclusion that no one could be so abjectly unfortunate. Has fortune, always inimical to me, stood in need of the pangs of love, that she might torture me more cruelly still? I cried out, unhappy wretch that I am! Fortune and love have joined forces to bring about my ruin. Cruel Eros himself had never dealt leniently with me. Loved or lover, I am put to the torture. Take the case of Chrysis. She loves me desperately, never leaves off teasing me, she who despised me as a servant, because, when she was acting as her mistress's go-between, I was dressed in the garments of a slave. She, I say, that same Chrysis who looked with contempt upon your former lowly lot, is now bent upon following it up, even at the peril of her life. She swore that she would never leave my side on the day when she told me of the violence of her passion. But Circe owns me, heart and soul, all others I despise. Who could be lovelier than she? What loveliness had Ariadne or Leda to compare with hers? What had Helen to compare with her? What has Venus? If Paris himself had seen her with her dancing eyes when he acted as umpire for the quarrelling goddesses, he would have given up Helen and the goddesses for her. If I could only steal a kiss, if only I might put my arms around that divine, that heavenly bosom, perhaps the virility would come back to this body, and the parts, flaccid from witchcraft, would, I believe, come into their own. Contempt cannot tire me out. What if I was flogged? I will forget it. What if I was thrown out? I will treat it as a joke. Only let me be restored to her good graces. At rest on my pallet, night's silence had scarce settled down to soothe me, and eyes heavy laden with slumber to lull, when torturing amour laid hold of me, seizing my hair and dragging me, wounding me, ordered a vigil till dawn. O heart of stone, how canst thou lie here alone? Said the god. Thou joy of 1,000 sweet mistresses, how, O my slave? In disarrayed nightrobe I leap to bare feet, and essay to follow all paths, but a road can discover by none. One moment I hasten, the next it is torture to move, it irks me again to turn back, shame forbids me to halt and stand in the midst of the road. Lo, the voices of men, the roar of the streets and the songs of the birds, and the bark of vigilant watchdogs are hushed. Alone, I of all society, dread both my slumber and couch, and obey, great Lord of the passions, thy mandate which on me was laid. Chapter the 139th. Such thoughts as these, of lovely Circe's charms, so wrought upon my mind that I disordered my bed by embracing the image, as it were, of my mistress, but my efforts were all wasted. This obstinate affliction finally wore out my patience, and I cursed the hostile deity by whom I was bewitched. I soon recovered my composure, however, and, deriving some consolation from thinking of the heroes of old who had been persecuted by the anger of the gods, I broke out in these lines: Hostile gods and implacable rate not me alone pursue. Heracles once suffered the weight of heaven's displeasure too, driven from the Ennachian coast. Laomedon of old sated too of the heavenly host. In Peleus behold Juno's power to avenge an affront. And Telephus took arms, knowing not he must bear the brunt. Ulysses feared the storms angry Neptune decreed as his due. Now, me to overwhelm, outraged Priapus ever pursues on land and Nereus' realm. Tortured by these cares, I spent the whole night in anxiety, and at dawn Giton, who had found out that I had slept at home, entered the room and bitterly accused me of leading a licentious life. He said that the whole household was greatly concerned at what I had been doing, that I was so rarely present to attend to my duties, and that the intrigue in which I was engaged would very likely bring about my ruin. I gathered from this that he had been well informed as to my affairs, and that some one had been to the house inquiring for me. Thereupon I began to ply Giton with questions as to whether any one had made inquiry for me. "Not today," he replied, "but yesterday a woman came in at the door, not bad looking either, and after talking to me for quite a while, and wearing me out with her far-fetched conversation, finally ended by saying that you deserved punishment, and that you would receive the scourging of a slave if the injured party pressed his complaint." This news afflicted me so bitterly that I levelled fresh recriminations against fortune, and I had not yet finished grumbling when Chrysis came in, and, throwing herself upon me, embraced me passionately. "I have you," she cried, "just as I hoped I would. You are my heart's desire, my joy. You can never put out this flame of mine unless you quench it in my blood." I was greatly embarrassed by this wantonness of Chrysis, and had recourse to flattery in order that I might rid myself of her, as I feared that her passionate outcries would reach the ears of Eumolpus, who, in the arrogance of success, had put on the manner of the master. So, on this account, I did everything I could think of to calm Chrysis. I feigned love, whispered compliments; in short, so skilfully did I dissimulate, that she believed I was love's own captive. I showed her what pressing peril overhung us should she be caught in that room with me, as Eumolpus was only too ready to punish the slightest offence. On hearing this, she left me hurriedly, and all the more quickly as she caught sight of Giton, who had only left me a little before she had come in, on his way to my room. She was scarcely gone when one of the newly engaged servants rushed in and informed me that the master was furiously angry with me because of my 2 days' absence from duty. I would do well, therefore, to prepare some plausible excuse, as it was not likely that his angry passion would be placated until some one had been flogged. Seeing that I was so vexed and disheartened, Giton said not a word about the woman, contenting himself with speaking of Eumolpus, and advising me that it would be better to joke with him than to treat the matter seriously. I followed this lead, and appeared before the old fellow with so merry a countenance that, instead of showing severity, he received me with good humour, and rallied me upon the success of my love affairs, praising the elegance of my figure which made me such a favourite with the ladies. "I know very well," he went on, "that a lovely woman is dying for love of you, Encolpius, and this may come in handy for us, so play your part, and I'll play mine too." Chapter the 140th. He was still speaking, when in came a matron of the most exclusive social set, Philomene by name, who had often, when young, extorted many a legacy by means of her charms. But an old woman now, the flower of her beauty faded, she threw her son and daughter in the way of childless old men, and through this substitution she contrived to continue her established policy. She came to Eumolpus, both to commend her children to his practical judgment, and to entrust herself and her hopes to his good nature, he being the only one in all the world who could daily instruct young children in healthy precepts. In short, she left her children in Eumolpus's house in order that they might hear the words that dropped from his lips, as this was the only legacy she could leave to them. Nor did she do otherwise than as she had promised, but left in his bedchamber a very beautiful daughter and her brother, a lad, and pretended that she herself was compelled to go out to a temple to offer up her vows. Eumolpus, who was so continent that even I was a boy in his eyes, lost no time in inviting the damsel to sacrifice to the Aversa Venus; but, as he had told every one that he was gouty, and that his back was weak, and as he stood in danger of upsetting the whole farce if he did not carefully live up to the pretence, he therefore, that the imposture might be kept up, prevailed upon the young lady to seat herself upon that goodness which had been commended to her, and ordered Corax to crawl under the bed upon which he himself was lying, and, after bracing himself by putting his hands upon the floor, to hoist his master up and down with his own back. Corax carried out the order in full, and skilfully seconded the wriggling of the girl with a corresponding see-saw. Then, when the crisis was about due, Eumolpus, in a ringing voice, called out to Corax to increase the cadence, and thus the old lecher, suspended between his servant and his mistress, enjoyed himself just as if he were in a swing. Time and again Eumolpus repeated this performance, to the accompaniment of ringing laughter in which he himself joined. At last, fearing I might lose an opportunity through lack of application, I also made advances to the brother, who was enjoying the gymnastics of his sister through the keyhole, to see if he would prove amenable to assault. Nor did this well-trained lad reject my advances, but alas, I discovered that the god was still my enemy. However, I was not so blue over this failure as I had been over those before, and my virility returned a little later, and, suddenly finding myself in better fettle, I cried out, "Great are the gods who have made me whole again! In his loving kindness, Mercury, who conducts and reconducts the souls, has restored to me that which a hostile hand had cut away. Look, you will find that I am more graciously endowed than was Protestilaus or any other of the heroes of old." So saying, I lifted up my tunic and showed Eumolpus that I was whole. At first he was startled, then, that he might believe his own eyes, he handled this pledge of the goodwill of the gods with both hands. Our good humour was revived by this blessing, and we laughed at the diplomacy of Philomene, and at the skill with which her children plied their calling, little likely to profit them much with us, however, as it was only in hopes of coming into a legacy that she had abandoned the boy and girl to us. Meditating upon this unscrupulous method of getting around childless old men, I began to take thought of the present state of our own affairs, and made use of the occasion to warn Eumolpus that he might be bitten in biting the biters. Everything that we do, I said, should be dictated by prudence. Socrates, whose judgment was riper than that of the gods or of men, used to boast that he had never looked into a tavern, nor believed the evidence of his own eyes in any crowded assembly which was disorderly. So nothing is more in keeping than always conversing with wisdom. Live coals are more readily held in men's mouths than a secret. Whatever you talk of at home will fly forth in an instant. Become a swift rumour and beat at the walls of your city, nor is it enough that your confidence thus has been broken, as rumour but grows in the telling and strives to embellish. The covetous servant who feared to make public his knowledge, a hole in the ground dug, and therein did whisper his secret, that told of a king's hidden ears. This the earth straightway echoed, and rustling reeds added that Midas was king in the story. Every word of this is true, I insisted, and no one deserves to get into trouble more quickly than he who covets the goods of others. How could cheats and swindlers live unless they threw purses or little bags clinking with money into the crowd for bait? Just as dumb brutes are enticed by food, human beings are not to be caught unless they have something in the way of hope at which to nibble. That was the reason that the Crotonians gave us such a satisfactory reception. But the ship does not arrive, from Africa, with your money and your slaves as you promised. The patience of the fortune hunters is worn out, and they have already cut down their liberality, so that either I am mistaken, or else our usual luck is about to return to punish you. Chapter the 141st. I have thought up a scheme, replied Eumolpus, which will embarrass our fortune-hunting friends sorely. And as he said this, he drew his tablets from his wallet and read his last wishes aloud as follows: "All who are down for legacies under my will, my freedmen only excepted, shall come into what I bequeath them subject to this condition, that they do cut my body into pieces, and devour said pieces in sight of the crowd. Nor need they be inordinately shocked, for among some peoples the law ordaining that the dead shall be devoured by their relatives is still in force. Nay, even the sick are often abused, because they render their own flesh worse. I admonish my friends, by these present, lest they refuse what I command, that they devour my carcass with as great relish as they damned my soul." Eumolpus had just started reading the first clauses, when several of his most intimate friends entered the room and, catching sight of the tablets in his hand, in which was contained his last will and testament, besought him earnestly to permit them to hear the contents. He consented immediately, and read the entire instrument from first to last. But when they had heard that extraordinary stipulation by which they were under the necessity of devouring his carcass, they were greatly cast down. But his reputation for enormous wealth dulled the eyes and brains of the wretches, and they were such cringing sycophants that they dared not complain of the outrage in his hearing. One there was, nevertheless, named Gorgias, who was willing to comply, provided he did not have too long to wait. To this Eumolpus made answer: "I have no fear that your stomach will turn, it will obey orders. If, for 1 hour of nausea, you promise it a plethora of good things, just shut your eyes and pretend that it's not human guts you've bolted, but 10,000,000 sesterces. And beside, we will find some condiment which will disguise the taste. No flesh is palatable of itself, it must be seasoned by art, and reconciled to the unwilling stomach. And, if you desire to fortify the plan by precedents, the Saguntines ate human flesh when besieged by Hannibal, and they had no legacy in prospect. In stress of famine, the inhabitants of Petelia did the same, and gained nothing from the diet except that they were not hungry. When Numantia was taken by Scipio, mothers with the half-eaten bodies of their babes in their bosoms were found. Therefore, since it is only the thought of eating human flesh that makes you squeamish, you must try to overcome your aversion with all your heart, so that you may come into the immense legacies I have put you down for." So carelessly did Eumolpus reel off these extravagances, that the fortune hunters began to lose faith in the validity of his promises, and subjected our words and actions to a closer scrutiny immediately. Their suspicions grew with their experience, and they came to the conclusion that we were out and out grafters, and thereupon those who had been put to the greatest expense for our entertainment resolved to seize us and take it out in just revenge. But Chrysis, who was privy to all their scheming, informed me of the designs which the Crotonians had hatched, and when I heard this news I was so terrified that I fled instantly, with Giton, and left Eumolpus to his fate. I learned, a few days later, that the Crotonians, furious because the old fox had lived so long and so sumptuously at the public expense, had put him to death in the Massilian manner. That you may comprehend what this means, know that, whenever the Massilians were ravaged by the plague, one of the poor would offer himself to be fed for a whole year, upon choice food at public charge, after which, decked out with olive branches and sacred vestments, he was led out through the entire city, loaded with imprecations, so that he might take to himself the evils from which the city suffered, and then thrown headlong from the cliff. End of section 19. End of the Satyricon, by Gaius Petronius ARBITER, translated by W.C. FIREBAUGH.